Sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones you choose, but the ones that choose you. Every father knows what it means to carry the weight of his child's future on his shoulders. The rain pounded Millfield Regional Airport as Jake Porter stood beside his old piper. "Captain." Morris pointed at the storm clouds and laughed. "Hey, Porter, why don't you fly through that mess? Show us what you can do." The other pilots chuckled at what seemed like a cruel joke. They saw a quiet single dad who flew cargo runs. They didn't know about his emergency medical flights, or the time he flew through a hurricane to save his daughter's life. Jake looked at the dark sky and nodded. He'd flown through worse storms for better reasons. What would happen when he took off into that dangerous weather? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered leather of Jake Porter's flight jacket told stories he never shared. Faded patches from a dozen different squadrons and bases clung to the worn material, their edges soft from years of handling. Most mornings, he'd run his thumb over the eagle insignia near the left pocket, a habit born from muscle memory and grief he'd never quite learned to put down. At 43, Jake had the kind of quiet presence that made people forget he was in the room until they needed something done right. His salt and pepper hair stayed perpetually tousled from wearing headsets, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who'd spent half his life gripping control sticks through turbulence that would terrify most pilots. But here at Millfield Regional, he was just the guy who flew freight runs to small towns and occasionally ferried weekend warriors to fishing lodges. The alarm clock beside his narrow bed buzzed at 4:30 every morning, same as it had for the past 3 years. Jake's apartment sat above Murphy's Hardware on Main Street, a modest 2-bedroom space that smelled faintly of aviation fuel and the coffee he brewed strong enough to wake the dead. The walls were bare except for a few photographs, him and Chloe at the county fair, her school pictures arranged chronologically, and one image he kept face down on his dresser that he only looked at on the hard days. Chloe's bedroom door stayed cracked open so he could hear if she called for him during the night. At 12, she was developing the independence that both thrilled and terrified him. But she still kept a stuffed elephant named Peanut on her pillow and still asked him to check for monsters under the bed when storms rolled through. Those were the moments that reminded Jake why he'd walked away from everything he'd been trained to do. The morning routine never varied. Jake would shower, dress in his standard uniform of khaki pants and a polo shirt with Millfield Aviation stitched over the pocket, then start breakfast while Chloe dragged herself from bed with the dramatic flair that seemed hardwired into 12-year-old girls. She'd stumble to the kitchen in her pajamas, dark hair sticking up in every direction, and accept the plate of scrambled eggs and toast with the solemnity of someone receiving communion. "Dad, Jenny's mom said pilots make tons of money," she'd mentioned one morning the previous week, not looking up from her orange juice. "So why do we shop at the discount grocery store?" Jake had paused in his coffee preparation, considering how to explain that military pensions and cargo pilot wages weren't quite the windfall civilian minds imagined. "Money's not everything, kiddo. We've got what matters." "I know," she'd said, and the simple acceptance in her voice had nearly undone him. "I was just wondering." The drive to Millfield Regional took 12 minutes through the sleepy downtown, past the diner where farmers gathered before dawn, and the post office where Mrs. Henderson waved from behind her counter every morning at exactly 6:15. Jake's beat-up Ford pickup truck had seen better decades, but it started reliably, and the radio still worked well enough to catch the weather reports that governed his daily existence. The airport itself was a modest operation. 2 runways, a small terminal building that doubled as the flight school office, and a row of hangars housing everything from crop dusters to the occasional corporate jet that strayed from the larger facilities in the city. Jake's hangar sat at the far end, number 7, and housed his Piper Cherokee, a sturdy, unpretentious aircraft that had carried him through countless miles of middle American sky. Sam Hendricks ran the fuel operation and had been working at Millfield since before Jake arrived. A Vietnam veteran with arms like tree trunks and a vocabulary that would make sailors blush, Sam had taken one look at Jake's flying and nodded his approval without ever asking about the man's background. It was an unspoken understanding among aviators. Some stories didn't need telling. Morning. "Jake," Sam would call out as Jake performed his pre-flight inspection, checking fuel, oil, and control surfaces with the methodical precision of someone who understood that attention to detail kept people breathing. "Got that charter to Springfield at 10, then the parts run to Centerville." The other pilots maintained a cordial but distant relationship with Jake. There was Rick Sullivan, who owned a Beechcraft Bonanza and flew real estate agents around the county. Maria Santos, who taught flying lessons and occasionally dropped wisdom that suggested she'd seen more sky than she let on. And Captain Morris, who'd retired from a major airline and now treated the small regional airport like his personal kingdom. Morris was the sort of pilot who'd never met a story about his own competence that he didn't enjoy telling twice. He'd established himself as the unofficial authority on all things aviation at Millfield, and his opinions carried weight with the younger pilots, who still believed that airline experience automatically translated to superior airmanship. Jake listened politely when Morris held court in the pilot lounge, nodding at appropriate intervals while mentally cataloguing the older man's blind spots and overconfidence. "Porter's solid enough," Morris had told one of the charter pilots within Jake's earshot. "Flies like a truck driver, but he gets the job done. Not much imagination, but cargo doesn't care about style points." Jake had continued reading his aviation magazine, giving no indication that he'd heard the assessment. In his experience, the pilots who talked the most often had the least to say when things went sideways at 8,000 feet in deteriorating weather. The truth was that Jake flew with the methodical precision of someone who understood that flashy maneuvers and unnecessary risks were the privilege of pilots who didn't have 12-year-old daughters waiting for them to come home. Every decision he made in the cockpit was filtered through the knowledge that Chloe needed her father more than the aviation community needed another hotshot pilot with stories to tell. His cargo runs took him throughout the region, medical supplies to rural clinics, parts for agricultural equipment during planting and harvest seasons, and occasionally more sensitive deliveries that required discretion and reliability over speed. The work paid enough to cover rent, groceries, and Chloe's needs, with little left over for luxuries. But it also meant predictable hours, minimal overnight travel, and the kind of flying that didn't require him to be away from home for weeks at a time. The afternoon ritual involved picking up Chloe from school, helping with homework at the kitchen table while she ate her after-school snack, and listening to the stories of 12-year-old drama that seemed simultaneously trivial and earth-shattering. She was developing her mother's laugh, a realization that caught Jake off guard at unexpected moments and made him reach for the photograph he kept face down on his dresser. Sarah had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a cancer that moved too fast for modern medicine to catch. Those final months had shown Jake what really mattered, stripping away everything except the essential truth that being present for the people you love matters more than any mission, any career, any sense of duty to abstract principles. Evenings were for reading together on the small couch, Chloe working through whatever young adult novel had captured her imagination, while Jake reviewed weather patterns and flight plans for the following day. She'd curl up against his side like she had when she was smaller, before adolescence started pulling her toward independence, and for those quiet hours, the world felt manageable. "Dad," she'd ask during one of these evening sessions, "do you miss flying the big planes?" Jake had considered his answer carefully. "I fly the right plane for the right reasons, kiddo. Size doesn't matter as much as purpose. But you used to fly different planes, right? Before we moved here." "Different planes," he'd agreed. "Different missions. But this is better, because you're with me. Because I'm with you." Sometimes, when Chloe was asleep and the apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street, Jake would pour himself a small glass of whiskey and sit at the kitchen table with his logbook. The entries from his current life were neat and methodical. Cargo runs, charter flights, routine maintenance flights that kept his skills sharp without pushing boundaries. But earlier pages told different stories, written in the same careful handwriting, but documenting flights that had tested every skill he'd ever learned, and some he'd had to invent in real time. Medical evacuations from forward operating bases, supply runs to outposts that existed only on classified maps, and reconnaissance flights that had carried him over terrain where mechanical failure meant more than just an inconvenient emergency landing. Those pages represented a different man, someone who'd lived for the adrenaline rush of difficult missions and the satisfaction of accomplishing what others deemed impossible. But that man had made the mistake of believing that duty to country and dedication to mission were more important than being present for the people who needed him most. He'd learned better, though the lesson had cost him more than he'd ever wanted to pay. Tuesday morning arrived with the peculiar stillness that preceded significant weather changes. Jake felt it in his bones before he saw the forecast. That electric tension in the air that made seasoned pilots check their instruments twice, and civilians complain about headaches. The barometric pressure was dropping fast, and the western sky held the bruised quality that promised serious storms by afternoon. The crumpled medical emergency call log lay on Sam Hendrick's desk, its urgent handwriting a stark reminder that somewhere in the mountains, time was running out for someone who needed help. The dispatch had come through at 9:15, interrupting Jake's review of cargo manifests and the comfortable routine of another ordinary day. Emergency dispatch rarely contacted Millfield Regional directly. The larger hospitals in the city had their own helicopter services and dedicated medevac operations. But sometimes geography and weather conspired to make the small regional airport the only viable option for those who couldn't wait for ideal conditions. Millfield Regional. This is Central Dispatch. We have a medical emergency at Pine Ridge Mountain Resort. Patient requires immediate transport to St. Mary's Hospital. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly. Requesting available aircraft for emergency medical evacuation. Sam Hendricks took the call while Jake continued his paperwork, listening with half an ear. Medical emergencies weren't uncommon in the mountains. Heart attacks, climbing accidents, severe allergic reactions that required more sophisticated treatment than the local clinic could provide. Usually the regular medevac service handled these calls with military precision and equipment specifically designed for medical transport. Dispatch, this is Millfield Regional. Our regular medical transport is down for maintenance. Aircraft won't be operational until Thursday. I've got a couple pilots here, but the weather forecast shows deteriorating conditions through the mountain passes. Jake looked up from his manifest as Sam glanced in his direction. The older man's expression suggested he was weighing options and finding them all problematic. Outside, the wind was picking up, sending loose papers skittering across the tarmac and making the American flag snap with increasing violence. Millfield Regional. Patient is a 62-year-old male experiencing chest pains and shortness of breath. Local clinic suspects myocardial infarction. Nearest advanced cardiac care is St. Mary's, approximately 45 minutes by air. Road access to Pine Ridge is compromised due to construction and weather. This is potentially life-threatening. The radio fell silent as Sam considered the situation. Jake set down his clipboard and walked to the window, studying the approaching storm system. Dark clouds were building to the west with the organized intensity that suggested a significant weather event. The wind was shifting, backing to the southwest, a pattern that typically brought sustained precipitation and reduced visibility through the mountain valleys. "I'll take it," Jake said quietly. Sam turned from the radio console, eyebrows raised. "You sure about that, Jake? Those mountain passes can get ugly fast when the weather turns. And this isn't cargo we're talking about. This is somebody's life, I'm sure. Captain Morris had been reviewing sectional charts at the pilot's table, but he looked up at Jake's words with the expression of someone who'd just heard an amusing joke. "Porter, you might want to think about this. Mountain flying in deteriorating weather isn't the same as your usual milk runs to small towns. This requires experience with emergency procedures and instrument approaches in challenging conditions." Jake met the older pilot's gaze without expression. "I said I'll take it." "With all due respect," Morris continued, his tone suggesting he intended none. "Medical emergencies require a different level of skill than cargo operations. The responsibility is significant, and mistakes have consequences beyond bent metal." The other pilots in the lounge had stopped their conversations to listen. Rick Sullivan looked uncomfortable with the tension, while Maria Santos watched Jake with curious interest. It was the sort of moment that defined reputations and relationships, where words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. "Sam, tell dispatch I'll be ready for departure in 20 minutes, Jake said, ignoring Morris entirely. "I'll need the current weather briefing for the Pine Ridge area and the latest conditions at St. Mary's Hospital." Morris stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with unnecessary force. "Jake, I've got 15,000 hours of flight time, including military transport and emergency operations. Maybe I should handle this one. The conditions are going to be challenging, and experience matters when lives are on the line." Jake paused in his movement toward the hangar, considering Morris's words. The older pilot wasn't wrong about experience mattering. Emergency medical flights required a specific skill set and the ability to make quick decisions under pressure. But Morris's confidence was built on airline experience, where procedures were standardized and backup systems were redundant. Mountain flying in deteriorating weather was a different animal entirely. "I appreciate the offer, Captain," Jake said, using the title with just enough emphasis to acknowledge Morris's seniority without conceding the point. "But I've got this one. Porter, this isn't about ego. It's about capability. You fly cargo runs and weekend charters. This situation requires someone with experience in emergency operations and instrument approaches in mountainous terrain." Jake opened the hangar door and began his pre-flight inspection, running his hands along the aircraft's surfaces with practiced efficiency. The Piper Cherokee wasn't the most sophisticated medical transport, but it was reliable and capable of handling short-field operations in challenging conditions. More importantly, Jake knew the aircraft's limitations and capabilities as well as he knew his own reflection. "What's your experience with mountain flying, Porter?" Morris called from the hangar doorway. "Have you ever flown emergency medical transport? Do you have instrument ratings for the approaches you'll need at Pine Ridge?" Jake continued his inspection, checking control surfaces and fuel levels while the weather radio crackled with increasingly urgent updates about the approaching storm system. The barometric pressure had dropped another 0.2 in the past hour, and visibility was decreasing rapidly throughout the mountain region. The truth was that Jake had more experience with emergency operations than everyone at Millfield Regional combined. But explaining that would require revelations he wasn't prepared to make. His military service had included missions that pushed aircraft and pilots to their absolute limits, often in conditions that would ground civilian aviation indefinitely. "Sam, I'll need the emergency medical kit and oxygen," Jake said, not turning around. "And get me a direct line to the hospital so I can coordinate with their emergency room staff." Morris stepped into the hangar, his frustration evident. "Jake, I'm trying to help here. This isn't a reflection on your regular flying. You're competent at what you do. But emergency medical transport is specialized work. Let someone with appropriate experience handle this." Jake straightened from his inspection and looked at Morris directly. There was something in his eyes that made the older pilot take a step backward. Not fear, exactly, but a recognition that he might have misjudged the quiet cargo pilot more significantly than he'd realized. "Captain Morris," Jake said, his voice carrying a calm authority that seemed to fill the hangar. "I've flown emergency medical transport before. I've flown in weather that would ground commercial aviation for a week. I've made instrument approaches to airfields that exist only on classified charts, and I've brought people home when everyone said it couldn't be done. But I don't need to prove anything to you or anyone else. I just need to get a sick man to the hospital before this weather gets worse. The radio in the lounge crackled with another update from dispatch. The urgency in the controller's voice, suggesting that time was becoming a critical factor. The patient's condition was deteriorating, and the weather window was closing rapidly. Jake climbed into the cockpit and began his startup procedures, the familiar sequence of switches and checks that transformed the aircraft from static machinery into a living, breathing tool capable of defying gravity and distance. His movements were precise and economical, each action performed with the confidence of someone who had completed these procedures countless times under conditions ranging from routine to life-threatening. Morris watched from outside the aircraft, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching respect. There was something about Jake's pre-flight routine that suggested experience, beyond typical civilian flying, a methodical thoroughness that spoke of training where mistakes had consequences beyond inconvenience. Jake, Morris called through the open cockpit window, his tone more conciliatory than before. If you're determined to do this, at least let me coordinate with air traffic control and emergency services at the hospital. I can make sure you've got all the support available. Jake looked at the older pilot and nodded. I'd appreciate that, Captain. Thank you. It was a small gesture, but it acknowledged Morris's experience while maintaining Jake's decision to fly the mission himself. The tension between them eased slightly, replaced by the professional cooperation that emergency situations demanded from competent aviators regardless of their personal differences. The Cherokee's engine settled into its familiar rhythm as Jake completed his checklist, gauges indicating normal operating parameters despite the challenging conditions ahead. Through the windscreen, he could see the storm clouds building with ominous intensity, their dark mass promising the kind of weather that separated experienced pilots from those who simply held certificates. Jake's hands moved across the navigation charts with practiced efficiency, plotting waypoints and calculating fuel requirements, while the storm warning radio crackled with increasingly urgent weather updates. The hand-annotated maps spread across his small desk told the story of a pilot who understood that survival in challenging conditions came from preparation, not luck. Each chart bore his careful notations, wind patterns during seasonal changes, turbulence reports from other pilots, notes about mountain downdrafts and valley fog formations that could turn routine flights into life-threatening situations. The margins contained calculations in his precise handwriting, fuel consumption rates at different altitudes, and emergency landing sites that most pilots never bothered to identify. Pine Ridge to St. Mary's Hospital, Jake murmured to himself, tracing the route with his finger. 42 nautical miles bearing 095 degrees. Mountain Pass at 7,000 feet, with alternate routes through Miller's Gap if weather closes the primary approach. The barometric pressure had dropped another 0.3 since the emergency call came through, and the wind was shifting to the southwest with increasing velocity. Weather patterns in the mountain region could change from marginal to dangerous in minutes, and Jake's charts showed 3 different approach options to Pine Ridge, each with its own risks and requirements. Sam Hendricks appeared in the hangar doorway, holding a clipboard and wearing the expression of a man who'd seen too many young pilots make deadly mistakes to feel comfortable with unnecessary risks. Jake, I've got the latest weather briefing from flight service. It's not looking good. Ceilings dropping fast, and they're forecasting moderate to severe turbulence through the mountain passes. What's the current ceiling at Pine Ridge? Jake asked without looking up from his calculations. 800 feet and dropping. Visibility 2 miles in rain and fog. They're saying it could go below minimums within the hour. Jake nodded, adding notes to his flight plan. The minimum ceiling for the visual approach at Pine Ridge was 500 feet. Below that, the flight would require instrument approaches that most small regional strips weren't equipped to handle. But Jake had studied the sectional charts carefully, and he knew there were options that other pilots might not consider. What about St. Mary's Hospital? Better right now, 1,500 feet, visibility 4 miles. But the front's moving east, so conditions there will deteriorate too. The emergency medical kit sat on Jake's workbench, its contents methodically organized and checked. Most cargo pilots never bothered with advanced medical supplies, but Jake's kit contained items that suggested experience with trauma situations: pressure bandages, airway management tools, and medications that required specific training to administer safely. "Dad?" Chloe's voice from the hangar entrance made Jake look up from his preparations. She stood there in her school clothes, backpack slung over one shoulder, looking uncertain about interrupting his work. It was barely 10 in the morning. She should have been in math class. "Hey, kiddo, what are you doing here? Isn't this a school day?" "Mrs. Peterson said I could come find you. There's talk around town about an emergency flight, and I wanted to make sure you're okay." Jake set down his pencil and walked over to his daughter, noting the worry in her dark eyes. At 12, she was old enough to understand that flying in bad weather carried risks, but young enough to still believe that her father was invincible. It was a delicate balance, reassuring her without lying about the realities of aviation. "Someone's sick up in the mountains and needs to get to the hospital," he explained, keeping his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "The weather's not great, but it's manageable. I'll be careful, but the other pilots were saying it's dangerous. Mr. Morris said you shouldn't go." Jake knelt down to Chloe's eye level, the way he had when she was smaller and needed reassurance about monsters under the bed. "Chloe, sometimes people need help, and if you can help them, you should. That's what we talked about, remember? About doing the right thing even when it's not easy?" She nodded, but the worry remained in her expression. "But what if something happens to you? What if you don't come back?" It was the question that haunted every pilot with family responsibilities, the balance between duty to others and obligations to those who depended on you. Jake had wrestled with it countless times over the past 3 years, and he'd made his choice to prioritize being present for Chloe over the more dangerous flying that had defined his earlier career. "I'm going to come back," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "I promise you that. This isn't the first emergency flight I've made, and it won't be the last. But I know what I'm doing, and I'm not going to take any unnecessary risks." "How do you know? How can you promise that?" Jake considered his answer carefully. "Because I've flown in worse weather than this, kiddo. Because I've made harder flights with less equipment and brought everyone home safe. And because you need your dad more than the world needs another hero." Chloe hugged him then, fierce and quick, the way she had when she was little and afraid of thunderstorms. "Just be careful, okay? Really careful. Always am." Sam cleared his throat from the doorway, holding a fresh weather printout. "Jake, I hate to interrupt, but we just got another update from Pine Ridge. Patient's condition is deteriorating. Local clinic is requesting immediate evacuation." Jake stood up, his mind shifting back to the technical requirements of the mission. Time was becoming a critical factor, not just because of the patient's condition, but because the weather window was closing rapidly. In another hour, the flight might become impossible rather than just dangerous. "Chloe, I need you to go back to school now. Tell Mrs. Peterson that I said thank you for letting you come check on me, but that everything's going to be fine. Can I stay until you take off?" Jake looked at his daughter's face and saw the same determination that had gotten her through her mother's illness and the difficult transition to their new life in Millfield. She was asking not as a child seeking entertainment, but as someone who needed to see him leave safely before she could concentrate on anything else. "You can stay until I taxi out," he agreed, "but then straight back to school. And no worrying about things you can't control." "Deal." Jake returned to his navigation charts, but his attention was divided between flight planning and the awareness that this decision would define how others saw him and how he saw himself. The comfortable anonymity of being just another cargo pilot was about to end, and he wasn't sure he was ready for the scrutiny that would follow. Captain Morris appeared in the hangar entrance, his expression suggesting he'd come to make one final attempt at dissuading Jake from the flight. Behind him stood Rick Sullivan and Maria Santos, both looking uncomfortable with the tension that had developed around what should have been a straightforward emergency response. "Porter, I've been thinking about this situation," Morris began, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his opinions carry weight. "Maybe we should contact the regional medical helicopter service. They've got the equipment and training for this kind of mission." "Already checked," Sam interjected. "Closest medevac helicopter is 40 minutes out, and they won't fly in these conditions. Their minimums are higher than ours for fixed-wing aircraft." Jake folded his charts and began loading his flight bag with the methodical precision of someone who understood that overlooked details killed people. Emergency frequencies, alternate airport information, approach plates for multiple airports, everything he might need if the situation developed complications. The emergency medical kit lay open on Jake's workbench, its specialized equipment arranged with the precision of someone who understood that seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Advanced trauma supplies that most cargo pilots never learned to use sat alongside standard first aid items: chest decompression needles, emergency cricothyrotomy kit, and cardiac medications that required specific training to administer safely. Jake's hands moved through the inventory with muscle memory that suggested experience beyond typical civilian aviation. Each item had its place, each medication had its proper dosage, and each piece of equipment represented knowledge gained through training that extended far beyond standard pilot certification requirements. "Where did you learn to use all that stuff?" Chloe asked, peering at the medical supplies with curiosity mixed with concern. "Air Force required emergency medical training for certain missions," Jake answered, not elaborating on the nature of those missions or the circumstances that had made such training necessary. "It's always good to be prepared." The takeoff sequence began with engine startup procedures that Jake performed with calm efficiency while the storm clouds continued building to the west. Outside, the windsock was dancing wildly, indicating gusty conditions that would challenge even experienced pilots. The Cherokee's engine settled into its familiar rhythm, gauges indicating normal operating parameters despite the challenging conditions ahead. Millfield ground. Cherokee 77 Alpha requesting taxi for emergency medical evacuation to Pine Ridge Resort, then continuing to St. Mary's Hospital. Cherokee 77 Alpha, Millfield ground. Taxi to runway 18, wind 190 at 15, gusting to 25. Altimeter 2958, contact tower when ready for departure. Jake acknowledged the clearance while performing his final pre-flight checks. The Cherokee responded smoothly to control inputs, systems operating normally despite the increasingly challenging external conditions. Through the windscreen, he could see Captain Morris and the other pilots watching from the terminal building, their expressions suggesting skepticism about his chances of completing the mission successfully. Chloe stood beside Sam Hendricks near the fuel pumps, keeping her promise to watch him taxi out before returning to school. At 12, she was old enough to understand that this flight carried more risk than his usual cargo runs, but young enough to still believe in her father's capabilities with the absolute faith that children reserve for their heroes. Cherokee 77 Alpha ready for departure. Jake transmitted to the tower controller. Cherokee 77 Alpha cleared for takeoff runway 18. Contact departure control on frequency 124.7. Fly safe out there. The takeoff roll demonstrated Jake's exceptional flying skills in a way that made the watching pilots take notice. Instead of the cautious, by-the-book departure they expected from a cargo pilot, Jake's technique showed the precision and confidence of someone thoroughly comfortable with challenging conditions. He rotated at exactly the optimal airspeed, climbed at the most efficient angle, and adjusted for wind drift with subtle control inputs that indicated experience with aircraft handling beyond typical civilian training. The Cherokee rose smoothly into the turbulent air, tracking straight despite the gusty crosswind conditions. "Well, I'll be damned," Morris muttered from the terminal building. Porter's got some moves after all. The initial climb took Jake through layers of increasingly rough air as he navigated toward the mountain passes that would lead to Pine Ridge Resort. At 3,000 feet, he encountered the first serious turbulence, sharp jolts that would have had nervous passengers gripping their armrests and questioning their life choices. Jake rode the turbulence with practiced ease, making small adjustments to power and attitude while maintaining his desired course and altitude. His radio crackled with position reports to air traffic control, his voice calm and professional despite conditions that were testing both aircraft and pilot capabilities. Millfield departure, Cherokee 77 Alpha level at 5,500, proceeding to Pine Ridge via Victor Airway 47. Requesting flight following and traffic advisories. Cherokee 77 Alpha radar contact. Squawk 4215 and maintain 5,500. Be advised, weather radar shows moderate to heavy precipitation along your route of flight. Pilot reports indicate moderate turbulence through the mountain passes. Jake acknowledged the information while studying the weather ahead. Dark clouds obscured the mountain peaks, and rain was already reducing visibility in the valleys. The flight would require careful navigation and constant attention to changing conditions, but nothing beyond his capabilities. Radio contact with Pine Ridge Resort provided additional information about the patient's condition and the local weather situation. The elderly man experiencing chest pains had been stabilized somewhat by the resort's medical staff, but he required advanced cardiac care that the rural clinic couldn't provide. Time remained critical. Pine Ridge Medical, this is Cherokee 77 Alpha inbound for medical evacuation. Estimate arrival in 22 minutes. What's your current weather condition? Cherokee 77 Alpha, Pine Ridge Medical. Current weather ceiling 800 feet, visibility 1 3/4 miles in rain and fog. Wind calm, patient is stable but requires immediate transport. We'll have ground transportation ready for rapid loading. Jake absorbed the information while navigating through increasingly challenging conditions. The mountain passes were developing their own weather systems, with downdrafts and wind shear that required constant attention and quick reactions. Lesser pilots might have considered turning back, but Jake pressed forward with the confidence of someone who had flown through worse conditions for more dangerous missions. The flight became a masterclass in mountain flying techniques that few civilian pilots ever needed to master. Jake used terrain features to his advantage, following valleys when possible and climbing only when necessary to maintain safe obstacle clearance. His navigation was precise, his altitude control exact, and his communication with air traffic control professional and thorough. At 15 minutes into the flight, he encountered the weather system's leading edge, a wall of rain and reduced visibility that transformed the flight from challenging to genuinely dangerous. Visibility dropped to less than 2 miles, and the cloud ceiling began forcing him lower toward the mountain ridges. Millfield departure, Cherokee 77 Alpha, requesting clearance to 8,000 feet due to deteriorating weather conditions. Cherokee 77 Alpha, climb and maintain 8,000. Be advised, minimum safe altitude in your area is 7,200 feet. Use caution for terrain. Jake began his climb while mentally reviewing emergency procedures and alternate landing sites. The flight was becoming more complex than originally planned, but still within acceptable risk parameters for someone with his experience and training. The Cherokee performed reliably despite the challenging conditions, its steady engine note providing reassurance as he navigated through increasingly hostile weather. His thoughts turned briefly to Chloe, probably sitting in her math class by now, trying to concentrate on homework while wondering about her father's safety. She deserved better than to worry about whether he would come home from work each day. But she also deserved a father who helped people when they needed it most. The dichotomy between safety and service had defined much of Jake's adult life. First in military service, where missions sometimes required accepting significant risks for strategic objectives, and now in civilian aviation, where emergency situations demanded balancing personal safety against the needs of others. Pine Ridge Resort appeared ahead through the rain and low clouds, its small airstrip carved into a mountain valley that required precise navigation and careful approach techniques. The landing would test every skill Jake had developed over years of flying in challenging conditions. But it was exactly the sort of situation his training and experience had prepared him to handle. Pine Ridge traffic. Cherokee 77 Alpha 5 miles south, inbound for landing. Request current winds and runway conditions. Jake reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the small piece of folded paper that had traveled with him through countless flights. Chloe's drawing of his airplane, rendered in crayon with the earnest imperfection that made it more precious than any professional artwork. The simple sketch showed a blue and white aircraft with "Daddy" written in purple letters along the fuselage, surrounded by clouds that looked like cotton balls, and a sun with an impossibly cheerful face. He'd started carrying the drawing 3 years ago, after Chloe had shyly presented it to him following one of his longer cargo runs. "So you don't forget about me when you're flying," she'd explained. And Jake had carefully folded the paper and placed it in his pocket, where it had remained ever since. The approach to Pine Ridge Resort required navigation skills that most civilian pilots never developed. The mountain valley created its own weather patterns, with downdrafts and wind shear that could catch unwary aviators off guard. Jake descended carefully, using the Cherokee's reliable handling characteristics to maintain precise control despite the challenging conditions. Pine Ridge traffic. Cherokee 77 Alpha turning final approach, runway 26. Any traffic in the area, please advise. The small airstrip materialized through the rain and low clouds, a narrow ribbon of asphalt carved into the mountainside, with terrain rising sharply on both sides. Trees lined the approach path, their tops disappearing into the low ceiling, and the runway surface showed standing water from the persistent rainfall. Jake's landing demonstrated the precision that came from years of operating in challenging conditions. He touched down exactly on his target point, used appropriate braking techniques for the wet runway, and taxied to the small terminal building where emergency vehicles were already waiting. The patient was a distinguished-looking man in his early 60s, conscious but obviously distressed. Resort medical staff had stabilized him as much as possible with their limited equipment, but his color remained poor and his breathing labored. Jake quickly assessed the situation with the eye of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies in much more primitive conditions. "How long has he been experiencing symptoms?" Jake asked the resort's head of security, who was coordinating the evacuation. "Started about 2 hours ago during breakfast. Chest pain, shortness of breath, nausea. We gave him aspirin and oxygen, but his condition hasn't improved much." Jake nodded, helping to transfer the patient to the Cherokee's passenger compartment. The aircraft wasn't configured as a dedicated medical transport, but he'd removed the rear seats and arranged the emergency medical equipment to provide the best possible care during the flight to St. Mary's Hospital. "Sir, I'm Jake Porter, and I'll be flying you to the hospital. We'll have you there in about 30 minutes. Just try to stay calm and let me know if you experience any changes in how you're feeling." The patient managed a weak smile. "I appreciate this, son. Weather doesn't look too good for flying. I've flown in worse," Jake replied, making his final preparations for departure. "We'll take it easy and get you to the doctors who can take proper care of you." The departure from Pine Ridge tested Jake's mountain flying skills as the weather continued to deteriorate. Visibility was dropping rapidly, and the cloud ceiling was forcing him to navigate through valleys rather than climb over the ridges as originally planned. The Cherokee responded smoothly to his control inputs, but the conditions were approaching the limits of safe operation. Millfield departure. Cherokee 77 Alpha departing Pine Ridge Resort with medical patient. Requesting direct routing to St. Mary's Hospital. Cherokee 77 Alpha, radar contact. Cleared direct St. Mary's Hospital. Maintain current altitude and advise if you encounter any difficulties with the weather conditions. Jake acknowledged the clearance while monitoring both his instruments and the patient's condition. The man was resting quietly in the passenger seat, connected to portable oxygen and monitoring equipment that Jake had learned to operate during his military medical training. The flight through the mountain valleys became increasingly challenging as visibility continued to decrease and turbulence intensified. Jake found himself flying through narrow corridors between mountain ridges, using his knowledge of local terrain features to maintain safe separation from obstacles that were now invisible in the clouds and rain. "How are we doing back there?" Jake called over his shoulder, keeping his voice calm and reassuring despite the demanding flying conditions. "I'm okay," the patient replied, though his voice carried strain that suggested his condition remained serious. "You're doing a fine job, pilot. This weather must be challenging. Nothing I can't handle," Jake answered, making minor adjustments to his flight path to avoid the worst of the turbulence. "We'll have you on the ground at St. Mary's in about 20 more minutes." Back at Millfield Regional, Captain Morris and the other pilots were monitoring Jake's radio transmissions with increasing concern about the weather conditions he was encountering. The latest weather reports showed the storm system intensifying rapidly, with conditions throughout the region approaching dangerous levels for single-engine aircraft operations. "He's flying through stuff that would ground the airlines," Rick Sullivan observed, listening to Jake's position reports and communications with air traffic control. Morris nodded grimly. "Porter's got more skill than I gave him credit for, but this weather is getting beyond what anyone should attempt in a Cherokee. If conditions get much worse, he won't have any choice but to find an alternate airport." Maria Santos had been plotting Jake's progress on a sectional chart, tracking his route through the mountain passes and noting the weather reports from stations along his flight path. "He's doing everything right so far. His navigation is precise and he's maintaining good communication with controllers. But this storm system is moving faster than the forecasts predicted." The radio crackled with Jake's voice, calm and professional despite the increasingly challenging conditions. "Millfield departure, Cherokee 77 Alpha, requesting vectors around weather cell bearing 090 degrees from my position. I'm showing heavy precipitation on that bearing. Cherokee 77 Alpha, turn left heading 060 degrees, proceed direct to St. Mary's Hospital when clear of weather. Be advised conditions are deteriorating rapidly throughout your area." Jake's acknowledgement came through clearly, his voice carrying no trace of the stress that the dangerous flying conditions must have been creating. The other pilots at Millfield Regional listened with growing respect for the professional competence being demonstrated under extremely challenging circumstances. 10 minutes later, the situation became significantly more complex when the patient's condition began to deteriorate. Jake noticed the change immediately. The man's breathing became more labored, his color grew ashen, and he began experiencing renewed chest pain despite the medical interventions that had been maintaining his stability. "Sir, are you experiencing more pain?" Jake asked, dividing his attention between flying the aircraft and monitoring his passenger's condition. "Yes," the man gasped. "It's getting worse again. Feels like someone's crushing my chest." Jake reached for his radio while maintaining precise control of the Cherokee through a particularly rough patch of turbulence. The situation now required coordination with medical personnel at St. Mary's Hospital, balancing the need for expedited arrival against the safety considerations imposed by the worsening weather. St. Mary's Hospital, Cherokee 77 Alpha. Patient is experiencing increased distress. Chest pain has returned, and breathing appears more labored. Can you provide medical consultation for in-flight care? The response came from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency room physician who had been coordinating with the flight. Cherokee 77 Alpha, we're standing by for your arrival. Based on your description, the patient may be experiencing extension of his myocardial infarction. Continue current medical support and advise us immediately of any further changes in his condition. Hidden in the depths of Jake's worn leather wallet, between Chloe's school photo and his pilot's license, lay a Purple Heart medal that he never discussed and rarely looked at. The small piece of metal represented a mission over hostile territory years earlier, when his aircraft had taken ground fire while evacuating wounded soldiers from a forward operating base that was being overrun by enemy forces. The medal had been awarded for wounds sustained during that mission, shrapnel from an explosion that had damaged his aircraft and injured his left shoulder, leaving scars that still ached during changes in barometric pressure. More importantly, it represented the moment when Jake had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what needed to be done despite being terrified. The return flight from Pine Ridge began in conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced military pilots. Visibility had dropped to less than a mile. The cloud ceiling was forcing Jake to navigate through valleys rather than over ridges, and ice was beginning to accumulate on the Cherokee's wings, despite his efforts to stay in warmer air. St. Mary's Hospital? Cherokee 77 Alpha inbound with cardiac patient. Estimate arrival in 28 minutes. Requesting emergency ground support and direct taxi to emergency department. Cherokee 77 Alpha, St. Mary's Hospital. Emergency medical team standing by. Current weather ceiling 1,000 feet. Visibility 3 miles in light rain. Wind calm. We're ready for your arrival. Jake acknowledged the transmission while making subtle adjustments to his flight path, using terrain features to shelter the aircraft from the worst of the turbulence. The patient remained conscious, but showed signs of increasing distress, his breathing more labored despite the supplemental oxygen. "How are you doing back there?" Jake called over his shoulder, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "Been better," the man replied with a weak smile. "But I appreciate what you're doing. This weather doesn't look safe for flying." "I've flown in worse," Jake answered, though privately he acknowledged that the conditions were approaching the limits of safe operation. "We'll have you on the ground in a few more minutes." The radio crackled with a transmission from Millfield Regional. Captain Morris's voice carrying a note of concern that suggested he was monitoring Jake's progress with increasing respect for the complexity of the mission. Cherokee 77 Alpha, Millfield Regional. "We're tracking your progress on radar. How are conditions out there?" Millfield 77 Alpha. "Moderate to severe turbulence, ceiling variable between 800 and 1,200 feet. Ice accumulation light but increasing. Patient stable but requires expedited arrival at hospital." There was a pause before Morris responded, his tone suggesting he was recalculating his assessment of Jake's flying abilities based on the calm professionalism being demonstrated in genuinely dangerous conditions. "Copy that, 77 Alpha. You're doing good work out there. Let us know if you need any assistance." The flight became a constant battle against deteriorating weather conditions that tested every aspect of Jake's flying skills. Wind shear in the mountain valleys created sudden altitude changes that required immediate corrective action, while ice accumulation on the wings gradually degraded the Cherokee's performance characteristics. Jake's experience with combat flying in Afghanistan had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation, operating at the edge of safety margins, while maintaining the calm focus necessary to make critical decisions under pressure. The skills he'd developed during years of military service were finally being put to use in service of saving lives rather than taking them. 20 minutes into the return flight, the situation became significantly more challenging when the patient's condition suddenly deteriorated. His color became ashen, his breathing more labored, and he began experiencing chest pains that suggested his heart attack was worsening. "Talk to me," Jake called back, dividing his attention between flying the aircraft and monitoring his passenger's condition. "Are you having more pain?" "Yes," the man gasped. "It's getting worse. Feels like someone sitting on my chest." Jake reached for his radio while maintaining precise control of the Cherokee through increasingly turbulent air. The situation required coordination with both air traffic control and medical personnel at St. Mary's Hospital. balancing the need for expedited arrival against the safety considerations imposed by the deteriorating weather. St. Mary's Hospital, Cherokee 77 Alpha. Patient's condition is deteriorating. Increased chest pain and respiratory distress. Can you patch me through to emergency medical for consultation? Within minutes, Jake was coordinating directly with an emergency room physician who guided him through additional medical interventions that could be performed in flight with the equipment available in his emergency kit. The doctor's calm instructions helped stabilize the patient somewhat, but time remained critical. The weather ahead was developing into a significant storm system that would soon make flight operations impossible. Jake studied his options carefully, weighing the risks of continuing towards St. Mary's Hospital against the possibility of diverting to a closer airport with less sophisticated medical facilities. His military training had prepared him for exactly these kinds of decisions, situations where there were no perfect choices, only calculated risks that had to be evaluated quickly and decisively. The patient needed advanced cardiac care that only St. Mary's could provide, but reaching the hospital would require flying through weather conditions that were rapidly becoming unsurvivable. Cherokee 77 Alpha, this is approach control. We're showing moderate to heavy precipitation along your route to St. Mary's Hospital. Pilot reports indicate severe turbulence and icing conditions. Are you able to continue, or do you need vectors to an alternate airport? Jake evaluated his options while the Cherokee bucked through another series of severe jolts that tested both aircraft and occupants. His fuel situation remained adequate. The aircraft was still performing within acceptable parameters despite the ice accumulation, and the patient's condition made diversion to a less capable facility potentially fatal. Approach control. 77 Alpha continuing to St. Mary's Hospital. Request vectors for the most direct route and priority handling for emergency medical arrival. Roger 77 Alpha. Turn left heading 080 degrees. Maintain 4,000 feet. You're cleared direct to St. Mary's Hospital via radar vectors. Emergency equipment will be standing by. The final approach to St. Mary's Hospital would require an instrument landing in weather conditions that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their limits. Jake began his descent through clouds that obscured all visual references to the ground, relying entirely on instruments and air traffic control guidance to maintain safe separation from terrain. Back at Millfield Regional, Captain Morris and the other pilots listened to Jake's radio transmissions with growing amazement at the professional competence being demonstrated under extremely challenging conditions. The quiet cargo pilot they had dismissed as unremarkable was displaying flying skills that suggested experience far beyond typical civilian aviation. Where the hell did Porter learn to fly like that? Rick Sullivan asked, his voice reflecting the awe that everyone in the pilot lounge was feeling. Morris shook his head slowly, his expression showing a combination of respect and puzzlement. I don't know, but that's not civilian flying we're hearing on the radio. That's military precision and experience talking. The military citation letter had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had become permanent fixtures in the paper, the official seal barely visible after years of handling. Jake never intended for anyone to see it. The document represented a chapter of his life that he'd deliberately closed when Chloe's mother died, and he'd made the decision to prioritize being a present father over serving his country in distant conflicts. The emergency that changed everything began 15 minutes from St. Mary's Hospital, when the patient's condition suddenly became critical. His breathing grew shallow and irregular, his pulse weakened, and his color took on the grayish pallor that experienced medical personnel recognize as a sign of impending cardiac arrest. St. Mary's Emergency, Cherokee 77 Alpha. Patient is experiencing severe deterioration. Pulse weak and thready, respiration shallow at 16 per minute. Patient becoming less responsive. I need immediate medical consultation. The radio crackled with the voice of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency room physician who had been monitoring their approach. Cherokee 77 Alpha, based on your description, the patient may be experiencing cardiogenic shock. We need to get him to the cardiac catheterization lab immediately upon arrival. Can you expedite your arrival time? Jake evaluated his options while fighting through turbulence that would have grounded less experienced pilots. The weather had deteriorated to the point where visual flight rules were no longer possible, and he was operating entirely on instruments through clouds that seemed determined to tear the Cherokee apart. Dr. Mitchell, I can get there faster, but it's going to require an approach that's not in the standard procedures manual. I need to know, how critical is time right now? Every minute matters. If we don't get him to the cath lab within the next 20 minutes, we're looking at a very poor outcome. That's when Jake made the decision that would reveal everything he'd been hiding for the past 3 years. Instead of following the standard instrument approach that would add precious minutes to their arrival time, he requested permission to perform a military-style tactical approach that would bring them straight down through the weather to the hospital's helipad. St. Mary's Tower. Cherokee 77 Alpha, requesting permission for non-standard approach direct to hospital helipad. I have experience with tactical approaches in adverse weather conditions. The tower controller's voice carried surprise and concern. Cherokee 77 Alpha, that approach is not approved for civilian aircraft. We cannot authorize deviation from published procedures. Jake keyed his microphone, and for the first time in 3 years, he used the call sign that had identified him during his military service. Tower, this is Major Jake Porter, United States Air Force, requesting emergency tactical approach authorization. I'm qualified for this procedure, and patient condition is critical. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds, broken only by the sound of the Cherokee's engine straining against the turbulent air. At Millfield Regional, Captain Morris nearly dropped his coffee cup as Jake's words came through the radio speaker. Did he just say, Major? Rick Sullivan asked, his voice reflecting the shock that everyone in the pilot lounge was feeling. Morris stared at the radio in disbelief. Air Force, Major. That explains a lot about how he's been handling this weather. At St. Mary's Hospital, the tower controller was conferring rapidly with his supervisor, trying to process the revelation that the civilian pilot requesting the dangerous approach was actually a military officer with appropriate training and authorization. Cherokee 77 Alpha, Major Porter, stand by while we verify your credentials and coordinate with hospital emergency services. Jake continued his descent through the storm while the controllers worked to confirm his identity and qualifications. The patient's condition was deteriorating rapidly, his breathing becoming more labored despite the supplemental oxygen and the medical interventions Jake had been performing based on radio consultation with the emergency room. Physician, Major Porter, came the voice of a different controller, one whose tone suggested military experience. This is Chief Controller Stevens. They have your service record here, and I see you're qualified for tactical approaches. You are cleared for emergency tactical approach to St. Mary's Hospital helipad. Emergency crews are standing by. The approach that followed was a masterclass in precision flying that few civilian pilots would have attempted even in perfect weather conditions. Jake brought the Cherokee down through the weather in a controlled descent that used minimal lateral movement while maintaining precise airspeed and altitude control. His military training took over completely, years of combat flying experience guiding every decision as he navigated through conditions that would have been impossible without extensive experience in tactical flight operations. The Cherokee responded to his control inputs with the precision of an aircraft being flown by someone who understood exactly how to extract maximum performance from every system. Back at Millfield Regional, the other pilots listened in amazement as Jake's radio transmissions revealed the depth of experience they had never suspected. His calm, professional communications with air traffic control demonstrated familiarity with procedures and terminology that went far beyond typical civilian aviation training. Major Porter, Captain Morris said quietly, his voice carrying a tone of respect that had been completely absent from their earlier interactions. I had no idea. Maria Santos shook her head slowly. 3 years we've been working with him, and none of us knew he was military. That explains why he never talked about his background. The tactical approach required Jake to descend through multiple layers of clouds while maintaining precise navigation to a landing area that was significantly smaller than typical airport runways. He used GPS guidance and radio beacons to maintain his approach path, making constant adjustments for wind and turbulence while keeping the aircraft within the narrow corridor that would bring him safely to the hospital. St. Mary's Emergency, Major Porter on final approach. Patient's condition remains critical but stable. Estimate touchdown in 2 minutes. Copy, Major Porter. Medical team is positioned and ready for immediate transport to cardiac cath lab. Outstanding work getting him here through this weather. The landing on the hospital's helipad was executed with the precision that came from years of operating in challenging conditions where mistakes had life or death consequences. Jake touched down exactly on target despite the gusty winds and limited visibility, immediately shutting down the engine and coordinating with the medical team that rushed to transfer the patient. As the patient was wheeled toward the emergency department, he managed to grab Jake's hand. "Thank you," he said weakly. "You saved my life." Jake squeezed the man's hand gently. "Just doing my job, sir. The doctors will take good care of you from here." Dr. Mitchell approached Jake as the patient disappeared into the hospital. "Major Porter, I don't know what your background is, but that was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. In these conditions, most pilots wouldn't have attempted that approach. Sometimes you do what needs to be done," Jake replied quietly. But his words carried the weight of experience that extended far beyond this single flight. As Jake prepared for the return flight to Millfield Regional, he realized that his carefully constructed civilian identity had been permanently shattered. The other pilots now knew about his military background, and questions would inevitably follow. The quiet anonymity he'd maintained for 3 years was gone, replaced by a reputation that would fundamentally change how others saw him. But as he thought about the patient who was now receiving the cardiac care that would save his life, Jake realized that some secrets weren't worth keeping when lives hung in the balance. The cockpit voice recorder continued its quiet operation, capturing every word and sound as Jake prepared for what would become the most challenging flight of his civilian career. The small device, no bigger than a paperback book, had been documenting his calm professionalism throughout the emergency mission, creating an audio record that would later astound aviation safety investigators and serve as a textbook example of crisis management in extreme conditions. St. Mary's Tower. Major Porter ready for departure, returning to Millfield Regional. Requesting weather update for return route. Major Porter, current conditions show deteriorating weather along your return route. Ceiling now 500 feet, visibility 1 mile in heavy rain, moderate to severe turbulence reported through mountain passes, icing conditions above 3,000 feet. Are you sure you want to attempt return flight in these conditions? Jake studied his instruments while considering the options available to him. The weather had worsened significantly during the time spent at the hospital, transforming what had been a challenging but manageable flight into something that approached the limits of survivability for single-engine aircraft operations. He could remain at St. Mary's Hospital overnight, waiting for conditions to improve, but that would mean missing Chloe's bedtime routine and leaving her to worry about his safety through the long hours of the night. She'd already endured too many nights, wondering if her father would come home safely, first during his military deployments and later during the terrifying months of her mother's illness. Tower, Major Porter will attempt return flight. I have experience with these conditions, and I need to get home to my daughter. The controller's response carried a note of understanding that suggested personal experience with the competing demands of duty and family. Roger, Major Porter. Cleared for departure. Contact approach on 124.7. Fly safe and give my regards to your little girl. The takeoff from St. Mary's Hospital took Jake immediately into instrument meteorological conditions that required complete reliance on his flight instruments and radio navigation aids. Visibility dropped to near zero as he climbed through multiple layers of clouds, while turbulence severe enough to test the Cherokee's structural limits made precise flight control a constant challenge. At Millfield Regional, Captain Morris had spent the past hour researching Jake's military service record through contacts he still maintained from his own Air Force Reserve days. What he discovered explained everything about the quiet pilot who had consistently demonstrated skills that exceeded typical civilian training. "Rick, you need to see this," Morris said, his voice carrying a tone of amazement as he read from his computer screen. Major Jake Porter, United States Air Force. 22 years of service, including multiple combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters. Air Medal with 12 oak leaf clusters. Purple Heart. And get this, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for a mission where he evacuated 37 wounded soldiers from a fire base that was under heavy enemy fire. Rick Sullivan stared at Morris in disbelief. "Medal of Honor? Jake Porter? The guy who flies cargo runs and doesn't say 10 words a day. The same guy who's currently flying through weather that would ground commercial aviation, bringing a heart attack patient to the hospital like it's just another day at the office." Maria Santos had been monitoring Jake's radio transmissions, and her expression reflected growing concern about the conditions he was encountering during his return flight. "He's reporting severe turbulence and icing. This weather system is getting worse by the minute." The flight back to Millfield Regional became a test of every skill Jake had developed during his military career and civilian flying experience. The Cherokee was being pushed to its operational limits by turbulence that created sudden altitude changes of hundreds of feet, while ice accumulation on the wings gradually degraded the aircraft's performance and handling characteristics. Approach control. Major Porter, at 4,000 feet, experiencing severe turbulence and moderate icing. Aircraft performance degrading due to ice accumulation. Requesting priority handling for approach to Millfield Regional. Major Porter, approach control. "We're showing you on radar, and we're prepared to provide vectors for the ILS approach to runway 18. Be advised that winds at Millfield are currently 210 at 28 knots, gusting to 35. Ceiling 400 feet. Visibility 3/4 of a mile in heavy rain, Jake." Acknowledged the information while working to maintain control of the Cherokee through conditions that were testing both his flying skills and the aircraft's structural integrity. The icing was becoming a serious problem, adding weight to the aircraft and disrupting the smooth airflow over the wings that provided lift. Each control input required more force, and the Cherokee's responses were becoming sluggish and unpredictable. His mind shifted into the analytical mode that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions in hostile territory. Ice accumulation could be managed through altitude changes and airspeed adjustments, but the options were becoming limited as the weather system expanded both vertically and horizontally. Approach control. Major Porter requesting descent to 3,000 feet to escape icing conditions. Major Porter, descend and maintain 3,000 feet. Be advised, minimum safe altitude in your area is 2,800 feet. Use extreme caution for terrain. The descent took Jake into warmer air that began melting the accumulated ice, but it also brought him closer to the mountain ridges that surrounded Millfield Regional. He was now flying in conditions that required constant attention to both terrain clearance and weather avoidance, with margins for error that had shrunk to almost nothing. At Millfield Regional, the tension in the pilot lounge was palpable as Morris and the others monitored Jake's progress through increasingly dangerous conditions. The latest weather reports showed that the storm had intensified beyond all forecasts, with conditions that were now officially unsurvivable for single-engine aircraft operations. "He needs to divert," Morris said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making safety decisions. Conditions at Millfield are below minimums, and they're getting worse by the minute. Maria Santos studied the weather radar display, her expression grim. Nearest alternate with better conditions is Riverside Municipal, but that's 40 miles southeast. I don't know if he has the fuel for a diversion in these headwinds. The radio crackled with Jake's voice. Still calm, but carrying an undertone that suggested he was fully aware of the severity of his situation. Approach control. Major Porter at 3,000 feet, experiencing moderate to severe turbulence. Aircraft handling is degraded but manageable. Requesting current conditions at Millfield Regional. Major Porter. Current Millfield weather ceiling 300 feet. Visibility 1/2 mile in heavy rain. Wind 220 at 32 knots, gusting to 45. Altimeter 2941. These conditions are below published minimums. For the ILS approach, Jake processed the information while the Cherokee bucked through another series of violent jolts that tested both aircraft, structure and pilot endurance. The weather at Millfield was now officially impossible for safe landing operations, but diverting to an alternate airport would consume fuel reserves that were already becoming critical. Approach control. Major Porter has sufficient experience to attempt the approach in current conditions. Request vectors for ILS, runway 18 approach. There was a long pause before the controller responded, his voice reflecting the difficult position of having to authorize an approach that was beyond normal safety parameters. Major Porter, understand you're requesting approach in below minimum conditions. This will be entirely at pilot's discretion. Turn left heading 270 degrees. Intercept localizer course 180 degrees. Jake acknowledged the clearance while beginning his approach preparations. The ILS approach would require precise instrument flying in turbulence severe enough to make accurate control inputs extremely difficult, with visibility so poor that he might not see the runway until the last few hundred feet of the approach. His military training took over completely as he configured the Cherokee for the instrument approach that would determine whether he made it home to Chloe or became another aviation accident statistic. Every decision now carried life or death consequences, not just for himself, but for the daughter who was probably doing homework at their kitchen table. Trusting that her father would keep his promise to come home safely. Millfield Tower. Major Porter established on the localizer, runway 18 in sight. Requesting landing clearance. Major Porter cleared to land runway 18. Wind 220 at 35, gusting to 42. Emergency equipment is standing by. The final approach would test every skill Jake had developed during 22 years of military flying and 3 years of civilian aviation. As he descended through the storm toward Millfield Regional, he carried with him not just the successful completion of a life-saving mission, but the hopes of everyone who had come to understand that the quiet cargo pilot was actually something much more extraordinary. The landing light assembly cut through the darkness and rain like a beacon of hope, illuminating the runway approach with brilliant white light that pierced the storm's fury. Jake had switched on the powerful lights during his final descent, knowing that every photon of visibility would be crucial for the most challenging landing of his civilian flying career. Millfield Tower. Major Porter on final approach, runway 18. Visibility extremely limited, but I have the approach lights in sight. Major Porter, cleared to land runway 18. Wind check 220 at 37, gusting to 43. Emergency equipment is positioned and ready. The Cherokee descended through the storm, with Jake fighting constant battles against wind shear that tried to throw the aircraft off the precise approach path required for a safe landing. Each control input had to be immediate and decisive. Hesitation in conditions like these meant the difference between a successful landing and a smoking crater beside the runway. At 500 feet above the runway, Jake encountered the worst turbulence of the entire flight. The Cherokee dropped suddenly, then lurched upward with violent force that tested both aircraft structure and pilot endurance. Lesser pilots would have executed a missed approach, climbing back into the storm to attempt another landing when conditions improved. But Jake pressed forward with the calm determination of someone who understood that sometimes there were no second chances. "Come on, girl," he murmured to the Cherokee, his hands steady on the controls despite the aircraft's violent movements. "We've come too far to quit now." The runway appeared through the rain and darkness at 200 feet, its lights creating a narrow corridor of salvation through the storm. Jake could see emergency vehicles positioned along the taxiways, their red and blue lights flashing through the driving rain as rescue crews prepared for what everyone expected might be a disaster. At 100 feet, a massive gust of wind caught the Cherokee and pushed it to the right of the runway centerline. Jake corrected with smooth control inputs that demonstrated years of experience with challenging landings, bringing the aircraft back on course, while maintaining the precise airspeed and descent rate required for touchdown on the rain-soaked runway. In the pilot lounge, Captain Morris and the other pilots watched through the terminal windows, straining to see the Cherokee's landing lights through the storm. The tension was palpable, as everyone realized they were witnessing either exceptional airmanship or a potential tragedy in progress. "I can see his lights," Maria Santos said quietly, her voice carrying the awe of someone watching a master craftsman at work. "He's actually going to make it." At 50 feet above the runway, Jake encountered the ground effect that changed the Cherokee's flight characteristics as it transitioned from free flight to landing configuration. The aircraft wanted to float in the cushion of air compressed between wings and runway, requiring precise power management to achieve touchdown. At exactly the right point, Jake's landing was a masterpiece of precision flying that would have been impressive in perfect weather conditions and was nothing short of miraculous in the storm that was battering Millfield Regional. The Cherokee touched down exactly on the runway centerline, its wheels making contact with the wet pavement in a landing so smooth that observers later described it as graceful despite the violent conditions. Millfield Tower. Major Porter down and safe on runway 18. "That's a good landing, thanks for the help." The tower controller's voice carried relief and professional admiration. "Major Porter, welcome home. That was some of the finest flying any of us have ever witnessed. Taxi to your hangar when ready, and congratulations on completing an outstanding mission." Jake taxied the Cherokee through standing water and crosswinds that continued to test his aircraft handling skills, even on the ground. The emergency vehicles followed at a respectful distance, their crews ready to respond, but recognizing that the crisis had passed through exceptional piloting rather than luck. As Jake shut down the Cherokee's engine in his hangar, the significance of what he had accomplished began to settle in. He had successfully completed a medical evacuation mission that had saved a man's life, demonstrated flying skills that revealed his true background, and returned home safely to keep his promise to Chloe. Sam Hendricks was the first to reach the hangar, his weathered face showing a combination of relief and amazement. "Jake, that was the most incredible piece of flying I've seen in 40 years of aviation. Where the hell did you learn to fly like that?" Before Jake could answer, Captain Morris appeared in the hangar doorway, followed by Rick Sullivan and Maria Santos. The older pilot's expression showed a complete transformation from the skepticism and condescension he had displayed earlier in the day. "Major Porter," Morris said, using Jake's military rank with obvious respect, "I owe you an apology. I had no idea of your background or capabilities. What you accomplished today was extraordinary, flying under impossible conditions." Jake began securing the Cherokee and organizing his equipment, uncomfortable with the attention and praise being directed his way. "I just did what needed to be done, Captain. Sometimes the job requires flying in less than ideal conditions." "Less than ideal?" Rick Sullivan asked incredulously. "Jake, you just landed in weather that would have grounded commercial aviation. That wasn't flying, that was aviation artistry." The radio in Jake's flight bag crackled with a transmission from St. Mary's Hospital, providing the final confirmation that the mission had been completely successful. "Cherokee 77 Alpha, this is Dr. Mitchell at St. Mary's Hospital. Your patient is stable and responding well to treatment. The cardiac catheterization was successful, and his prognosis is excellent. You saved his life today. The hospital bracelet that Jake had carefully preserved from the patient bore a simple identification: Robert Chen, age 62, Pine Ridge Resort. But it represented something far more significant than a piece of plastic with printed information. It was tangible proof that his decision to risk everything in impossible weather conditions had resulted in a human life being saved, a family that wouldn't have to endure the devastating loss of their patriarch. Jake sat in the Cherokee's cockpit for a moment after shutting down the engine, allowing the reality of what he had accomplished to settle into his consciousness. The storm continued to rage outside the hangar, rain drumming against the metal roof with relentless intensity. But inside the aircraft that had carried them safely through conditions that should have been unsurvivable, there was peace. "Major Porter?" Captain Morris's voice carried a tone that Jake had never heard from the older pilot, genuine humility mixed with professional respect that bordered on awe. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Jake climbed out of the Cherokee and faced Morris directly, noting how the man's entire demeanor had changed from the morning's confrontation. Where there had been skepticism and condescension, there was now the recognition of someone who had witnessed exceptional competence under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. "Captain Morris," Jake replied, his voice carrying the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his radio transmissions throughout the emergency mission. Morris extended his hand, and when Jake shook it, the older pilot's grip conveyed more than words could express. "I owe you more than an apology, Major. I owe you my respect and my admiration. What you accomplished today, bringing that man through this weather, landing in conditions that were beyond anything I would have attempted, that was flying at a level I've never witnessed in 40 years of aviation." Jake accepted the handshake, but deflected the praise with characteristic humility. "I was just doing my job, Captain. Someone needed help, and I was able to provide it. That's what we're supposed to do." "No," Morris insisted, his voice firm with conviction. "What you did today wasn't just doing your job. That was heroism, pure and simple. And I want you to know that everyone at this airport, everyone who witnessed what happened here today, understands that we've been working alongside someone truly exceptional." Sam Hendricks approached with a printed weather report in his weathered hands, his expression showing the kind of awe that veteran aviation professionals reserve for truly extraordinary achievements. "Jake, I just got the official weather summary for the time period when you were making your approach. Winds gusting to 45 knots, visibility 1/4 mile, ceiling 200 feet. The National Weather Service is calling it the most severe storm to hit this region in 15 years. Rick Sullivan whistled softly as he studied the weather data. "Major, I've been flying for 23 years, and I wouldn't have attempted takeoff in those conditions, much less tried to land. How did you maintain control in that kind of turbulence?" Jake began organizing his flight equipment, still uncomfortable with being the center of attention, despite the extraordinary nature of his achievement. "Training and experience, mostly. When you've flown in conditions where people are shooting at you, weather becomes just another challenge to manage." Maria Santos had been quietly observing the interaction, but now she stepped forward with the kind of direct question that experienced pilots ask when they want to understand the technical aspects of exceptional flying. "Major Porter, I need to ask, your approach technique during that landing, the way you handled the wind shear and maintained runway alignment, where did you learn those skills?" Jake paused in his packing, considering how much of his background to reveal to colleagues who had just discovered that their assumptions about him were completely wrong. "Combat search and rescue operations in Afghanistan. When you're extracting wounded soldiers from hostile territory in a helicopter that's taking ground fire, you learn to land aircraft in conditions that most people would consider impossible." The hangar fell silent as the implications of Jake's words settled in. These weren't just enhanced civilian flying skills they had witnessed. They were observing the practical application of military aviation training that had been developed for life or death situations in combat zones. Captain Morris broke the silence with a question that carried deep professional significance. Major, would you consider accepting the position of chief pilot here at Millfield Regional? We need someone with your experience and capabilities, leading our flight operations. Jake finished packing his equipment and looked around the hangar at faces that showed genuine respect and admiration for what he had accomplished. It was a moment of recognition that he had spent 3 years trying to avoid, but which now felt inevitable, given the circumstances that had revealed his true capabilities. "I appreciate the offer, Captain," Jake replied, with the same quiet dignity that had characterized all his interactions that day. "But I'm content with what I'm doing. I've got a daughter who needs her father to come home safely every day, and that's more important to me than any position or recognition." Morris nodded slowly, his expression showing understanding of the priorities that guided Jake's decisions. "I respect that, Major, but I want you to know that the offer stands, and that everyone here now understands exactly who you are and what you're capable of." As Jake prepared to leave the airport and return to Chloe, he realized that his carefully maintained anonymity was gone forever, replaced by a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his aviation career. The new flight assignment sheet that appeared on Jake's desk the following Monday morning contained opportunities that reflected his newly recognized capabilities and heroic nature. Chief pilot positions, emergency medical transport coordinator, flight instructor for advanced weather flying techniques, each offering significantly more money and professional recognition than his current cargo operations. Jake studied the various proposals while sipping his morning coffee, noting how quickly word of his emergency mission had spread throughout the regional aviation community. Apparently, extraordinary flying in impossible conditions was the kind of story that aviation professionals shared with reverent attention to detail. But as he read through the opportunities, his thoughts kept returning to Chloe's homework session the previous evening, when she had asked for help with a school project about heroes. The assignment had required her to interview someone she considered heroic and write about their qualities and achievements. "Dad, would you help me with my hero project?" she had asked, spreading her school supplies across the kitchen table with the methodical organization that she had inherited from him. "Of course, kiddo. Who are you writing about?" Chloe had looked at him with the kind of direct honesty that 12-year-olds possessed before the world taught them to be more diplomatic. "You. Mrs. Peterson said we could write about family members, and I want to write about you." Jake had set down his weather charts and given his daughter his complete attention, recognizing that this conversation was more important than any flight planning he might need to complete. "Chloe, I'm not sure I'm the right choice for a hero project. There are lots of people who've done much more important things than flying cargo around the region. But that's not all you do, is it?" She had replied with the perceptiveness that sometimes surprised him. "Yesterday, everyone at school was talking about how you saved someone's life by flying through a terrible storm. And sometimes you get phone calls at night, and you have to go help people who are hurt or sick." Jake had realized that his daughter was far more aware of his emergency flying activities than he had assumed. Despite his efforts to shield her from worry about his more dangerous flights, she had been observing and understanding more than he had given her credit for. "Flying is just what I do, Chloe. It's not heroic. It's just a job that sometimes helps people. But you choose the jobs that help people, don't you? You could fly different things, but you choose to help people who are hurt or scared or lost." The conversation had continued for another hour, with Chloe asking questions that revealed her mature understanding of the choices her father made and the priorities that guided his decisions. By the end of their discussion, Jake had realized that his daughter saw him more clearly than he saw himself. Now sitting at his desk with employment opportunities that could change their financial situation significantly, Jake found himself applying the same criteria that had guided his decision to leave military service and focus on being present for his daughter. Money and recognition were less important than being the kind of father who came home every evening to help with homework and read bedtime stories. Sam Hendricks knocked on the hangar doorframe, holding a steaming coffee cup and wearing the expression of someone who had been thinking about recent events with the perspective that came from decades of aviation experience. "Morning, Jake. I see you've got some interesting job offers there." "Word travels fast in aviation circles," Jake replied, not looking up from the papers. "Everyone seems to think that one emergency flight makes me qualified for positions I've spent 3 years trying to avoid." Sam settled into the folding chair beside Jake's desk, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup for warmth. "You know, I flew helicopters in Vietnam. Saw a lot of pilots who could handle routine missions just fine. But when things got complicated, when people's lives were on the line and conditions were impossible, most of them found excuses to let someone else take the risks." Jake waited for Sam to continue, recognizing the tone of voice that preceded wisdom earned through hard experience. "But there were a few pilots, not many, maybe 1 in 50, who seemed to get calmer when things got dangerous. They were the ones who volunteered for the missions that nobody else wanted. Not because they were reckless, but because they understood that someone had to do the hard jobs, and they had the skills to do them right. Sam, I'm not looking to be anyone's hero. I just want to fly cargo runs and be home for dinner with my daughter." The older man smiled with understanding that suggested he had once faced similar choices between career advancement and family priorities. "Jake, nobody's asking you to be a hero. But what happened yesterday, what you did for that man and his family, that's going to follow you whether you want it to or not. The question is, what are you going to do with the reputation you've earned?" Over the following weeks, Jake found that his life at Millfield Regional had changed in subtle but significant ways. The other pilots treated him with genuine respect, asking for advice about challenging weather conditions and seeking his opinion on technical flying matters. Captain Morris had become an ally rather than a skeptic, often referring younger pilots to Jake for guidance on mountain flying techniques and emergency procedures. But the most important change was invisible to outside observers. Jake had stopped hiding from who he was and what he was capable of accomplishing. He continued flying cargo runs and maintaining his quiet lifestyle, but he also began accepting more emergency medical flights and weather-related rescue missions that utilized his exceptional skills for purposes that clearly benefited others. 3 months after the storm that had revealed his true capabilities, Jake received a letter from Robert Chen, the man whose life he had saved during that desperate flight to St. Mary's Hospital. The letter contained a photograph of Chen with his grandchildren at a family reunion, along with a simple message: "Thank you for giving me the chance to see them grow up." That evening, as Jake helped Chloe with her homework at their kitchen table, she looked up from her math problems with the kind of serious expression that preceded important questions. "Dad, are you happy with your job?" Jake considered his answer carefully, thinking about the opportunities he had declined and the choices he had made to prioritize being present for his daughter over career advancement or recognition. "I'm flying the right plane for the right reasons, kiddo. Sometimes that's all the happiness a person needs." Chloe smiled and returned to her homework, satisfied that her father had found the balance between helping others and being the dad she needed him to be. And in the quiet evening light of their modest apartment above Murphy's Hardware, Jake realized that true heroism wasn't about the storms you flew through, but about the people you came home to when the flying was done.